The last free dinner. The shove came without warning. 1 second I was reaching for the back of my chair, my fingers just grazing the wood. The next, both of Dana's palms connected with my shoulders. Not a nudge, not a stumble, but a deliberate, two-handed shove with everything she had. And I was airborne. My boots left the tile. My back hit the kitchen floor. My father had laid himself with his own hands 23 years ago, ceramic squares he'd grouted on a Saturday afternoon while I sat on the counter eating saltine crackers and handing him tools I didn't know the names of. The impact knocked every cubic inch of air out of my lungs. I lay there for 1 full second staring at the water-stained ceiling of the house I had been paying $3,900 a month to keep standing. Then the laughter started. Not one person. All of them. Dana threw her head back, her wine glass still in her hand, red Cabernet sloshing dangerously close to the rim. Aunt Patrice covered her mouth with her napkin, but her shoulders were heaving. Dana's 2 friends, women I had never met who were eating food bought with my government salary, cackled like it was the funniest thing they'd seen all year. I looked at my mother. Ruth was sitting at the head of the table, my father's chair, the one he'd sat in every Sunday for 31 years. And she wasn't laughing. But she wasn't moving either. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed somewhere slightly above my head, as though the ceiling were suddenly very interesting. I lay on the floor of my father's kitchen for exactly 3 seconds. Then I got up. I didn't grab Dana's wine glass and empty it over her head. I didn't flip the table. I didn't say a single one of the 47 things that were detonating in the back of my mind like ordnance on a live range. I smoothed the front of my shirt. I straightened my spine until it was a rod of cold iron. I looked directly at my sister across the ruins of Sunday dinner, and I smiled. The quiet, specific smile of a person who has just received the last piece of information they needed. "Enjoy your meal," I said. My voice was so calm it scared even me. "It's the last free one you'll ever have." I reached into the pocket of my jeans. My thumb found the screen. 1 tap, cold and deliberate as pulling a trigger. And I walked out the front door into the San Antonio night without looking back. By morning, 71 missed calls. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back 5 years, to the week I signed a mortgage that was never supposed to be mine. My father died on a Tuesday in September. I remember the smell more than anything else. Cut grass and motor oil. The specific combination that meant Dad was home, Dad was working, Dad was there. He didn't die in a hospital with machines and flowers and the hushed choreography of institutional death. He went down in the front yard of our house in the northeast corner of San Antonio, his heart giving out while his hands were still wrapped around the handlebar of his old riding mower, the John Deere he'd owned since I was in middle school, and maintained with the reverent, obsessive care of a man who believed that things worth having were worth keeping. I was 200 miles away at Fort Hood, mid-stride in a field training exercise, when my phone vibrated against my ribs. By the time I pulled my truck into the driveway, the paramedics were gone. The mower was still idling in the front yard, chugging in patient circles until the tank ran dry. I sat in my truck for 4 minutes and 40 seconds. I know because I counted. And then I got out and turned the key and listened to the engine go quiet and understood that something that had been running for a very long time had just stopped. He left behind a jar of ashes, a widow who had never balanced a checkbook in her life, and a neon orange foreclosure notice taped to the front door. $194,000. That was the price of our history. The only piece of land the Mercer family had ever owned was about to be absorbed into the holdings of a bank in downtown San Antonio, and nobody in my family had any realistic means of stopping it, except me. 2 days after the funeral, we sat around the kitchen table. The surface was a graveyard of crumpled napkins and cooling coffee, and the particular exhausted silence of people who have been crying for 72 hours and have run out of both tears and things to say. My mother Ruth sat at the head of the table, not in Dad's chair, she couldn't do that yet. Her eyes red and vacant, her hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't drunk from in an hour. My sister Dana sat across from me. Dana was 44 years old, twice divorced, and had been between jobs for the better part of 18 months. Her credit score was, in the clinical language of financial institutions, non-qualifying. She was scrolling through her phone with her thumb moving in that specific, rhythmic, mindless way that meant she was on social media and not thinking about anything happening in the actual room around her. My mother had no income, no savings. The life insurance policy my father had maintained for 30 years had a payout that would cover 6 months of mortgage payments and nothing else. Every pair of eyes in that room eventually found me. I was the officer, the one with the steady government paycheck, the direct deposit that hit every 2 weeks without fail, the credit score I had built from scratch through 11 years of discipline and 0 late payments. I was 36 years old, and I had spent my entire adult life becoming the most reliable person in any room I walked into. In the outside world, that was an asset. In my family, it was a target. "Reagan," my mother said. She didn't look at the foreclosure notice. She looked at me. "We're drowning." My military brain did what it was trained to do. I saw a squad in distress. I saw a perimeter failing. I assessed the situation, identified the objective, and made the call. I did not understand, sitting at that kitchen table in the September heat with my father's mower still damp from the yard outside, that in my family, being the capable one didn't make you the leader. It made you the resource.
Sin.
The mortgage office was a depressing strip of commercial real estate on the west side of the city. Low ceilings, carpet that smelled of old coffee and resignation, a fluorescent light overhead that buzzed with the specific frequency of institutional misery. The loan officer looked like he had not been outside since the previous administration. He slid the papers across the desk. I hesitated. The air in the room felt thin. My eyes moved across the numbers. $238,000 with interest, 15-year term, my name as the primary obligor and sole income qualifying party. I had trained for situations where the stakes were irreversible. I understood, looking at those papers, that this was one of them. Then I felt my mother's hand close around my forearm. She didn't just hold me. She gripped me, her fingernails pressing into my skin with the specific, desperate strength of a person clinging to the last solid thing in a flooding room. I felt the crescents forming. "I promise, Reagan," she whispered, and her voice was wet and jagged and entirely convincing. "We will all contribute. Dana has a lead on something. I'll find part-time work. I just cannot lose this house. I cannot die anywhere else." I looked at the red marks on my arm. I looked at her tears. I picked up the pen. The nib scratched against the paper. A dry, final sound in the quiet office. One signature, then another, then a third. I felt the weight of the house settle onto my shoulders, the way a full rucksack settles at the start of a 20-mile march. Distributed, deliberate, and absolutely inescapable. For the first 3 months, the arrangement held. My mother sent her portion. Modest, but real. Dana made noise about a position she was interviewing for, a contact she was following up with, a timeline that kept shifting 2 weeks forward every time I asked about it. I gave them both the benefit of the doubt, because that was what I had been trained to do when the intelligence picture was incomplete. Hold position, gather information, avoid premature escalation. The 4th month, the check from my mother stopped. The 5th month, I was standing on a sun-cracked training field at Fort Hood, my face caked with Texas dust and the specific grit of a day that had started at 04:30 and showed no signs of ending. My phone vibrated against my ribs. I pulled it out, expecting a tactical update. It was a bank notification. Automatic withdrawal. $3,900. My checking account emptied. That money was my rent, my groceries, the car payment on a truck that was already 7 years old and running on borrowed time. I stood in the middle of a field full of soldiers and felt more completely alone than I had ever felt in any forward operating base, any remote outpost, any situation the Army had placed me in during 11 years of service. My mother hadn't borrowed my credit. She had weaponized my loyalty. She had understood, correctly, completely, without ever saying it aloud, that I would never let the house fall, that I would rearrange my entire life before I would allow a foreclosure notice to go to a county courthouse with my name on it. She had made that calculation the moment she reached across the desk and pressed her fingernails into my arm. I looked at the notification for a long moment. Then I put the phone back in my pocket, squared my shoulders, and marched into the dust. I was a soldier. And a soldier knows, the moment an ambush springs, that the only way out is forward. What a soldier eats alone. 14 months into my sentence as the family bank, Dana came home. She did not arrive with a plan. She arrived with 4 hard-shell suitcases that groaned against the driveway pavement. A designer tote bag slung over one shoulder like a trophy, and the specific energy of a woman who had just finished her second divorce the way she finished everything. Messily, expensively, and in a way that left someone else holding the cleanup bill. She dropped her keys on the kitchen table, the same table where I had signed away my financial freedom 14 months earlier, and looked around the house with the proprietary ease of someone checking into a hotel they had already decided they deserved. "Just until I get my feet under me," she told my mother. "A few weeks, maybe a month." A few weeks became 2 months. 2 months became 4. The weeks could be measured in the recycling bin out back, which began filling up with empty bottles of expensive Chardonnay and takeout containers from an Italian place downtown that charged $18 for pasta. Her clothes, a sprawling landscape of fast fashion and synthetic fabrics, migrated from her suitcases to the laundry room, to the living room couch, to every horizontal surface in the house, with the patient, territorial expansion of an occupying force. She contributed to the household expenses exactly nothing. Not a dollar toward the mortgage, not a 20 toward the utility bills, not a thank you toward the woman whose government salary was the reason the lights came on every morning when she reached for the switch. I tried to address it with my mother. I drove to the house on a Saturday and found Ruth in her bedroom, the air thick with lavender spray and the specific staleness of a room where the windows hadn't been opened in weeks. I laid my bank statements on her bedspread, white paper, black ink, numbers highlighted in yellow that told a story no reasonable person could misread. I pointed to the utility spikes. I showed her the month-over-month increase in household expenses since Dana's arrival. I asked, in the measured tone my 11 years of military service had given me, for situations requiring restraint when Dana was planning to contribute. My mother did not look at the numbers. She looked at me with the expression she had been perfecting since Donna and I were children. The wounded, slightly accusatory look of a woman who found financial conversations personally offensive when they involved her favorite daughter. "Your sister is at rock bottom, Reagan," she said, her voice taking on the defensive edge she reserved for moments when she knew she was wrong but had decided not to acknowledge it. "She just lost her second marriage. She is grieving. She is trying. Don't make this harder than it already is. You have your army salary. You're managing." The silence that followed was thick enough to press against my skin. I was managing. That was the word she used, managing. I was managing on black beans and rice, eaten out of a plastic bowl on a milk crate in a studio apartment 40 miles from the base, because the studio was the only thing I could afford after the mortgage payment cleared every month. I was managing with rusted water that bled from my pipes every morning, and a radiator that clanked through the night like something dying inside the walls. I was managing with a truck that had 194,000 miles on the odometer and screamed every time I turned the ignition, a sound I had learned to interpret as the vehicular equivalent of my own financial distress. My mother looked at my highlighted bank statements and saw a woman who was managing. I turned around and walked out of her room without another word. Yay! I discovered the lock on a Sunday afternoon in October. I had driven to the house on a rare afternoon of leave to retrieve a winter coat I had left in my childhood bedroom closet, a heavy canvas field jacket I had owned for 8 years and could not afford to replace. I let myself in through the front door. The house smelled like Dana's perfume, that thick synthetic sweetness that always sat at the back of my throat. I walked upstairs, my boots quiet on the carpet. I reached for the handle of my bedroom door. It didn't turn. I tried again, putting weight behind it, testing the latch the way you test any barrier that shouldn't be there. Nothing. I looked closer. There was a new lock set installed in the center of the door. Shiny brass, solid, recently mounted. The kind of lock you buy when you want to make a statement about ownership. Carla had not merely occupied my bedroom. She had claimed it, secured it, and locked me out of the only space I had ever had in the house I was buying. The room where my father used to read to me, where my service medals had once been pinned to the wall before they were boxed up and moved to a shelf in the closet to make room for her things. But it wasn't just the lock. Sitting on the threshold, directly in front of the locked door, was a pair of men's work boots, size 12, caked in dried mud and wood shavings. The smell hit me immediately. Sweat, tobacco, the unmistakable evidence of a stranger living in my childhood bedroom. I stood in that hallway for a very long time. I was the one paying the mortgage. I was the one paying the property taxes, the homeowner's insurance, the quarterly pest control, the twice-yearly HVAC service. I was the one eating beans on a milk crate, so the lights in that house stayed on. And I was standing in my own hallway feeling like an intruder. I did not pound on the door. I did not call downstairs for my mother. I knelt down on one knee, pulled out my phone, and photographed the boots. I photographed the lock. I photographed the trail of dried mud leading under the door. I stood up, walked back down the stairs, out the front door, and drove away without my coat. Some intelligence is too important to react to immediately. You gather it, you store it, you wait until you have the complete picture. The complete picture arrived on my 37th birthday, November 19th. I was up at 0500, my internal clock as reliable as ever. I looked at my phone, a reflex, checking for messages the way a soldier checks their perimeter. The screen was dark, no text from my mother, no call from Dana, not even a generated social media notification from either of them. I was 37 years old, and to the people I had been financially sustaining for the better part of 3 years, I had ceased to exist as anything other than a deposit schedule. The base was cold that morning, the kind of Texas November cold that surprises people who think the state doesn't get cold. A damp, cutting wind off the hill country that found every gap in your clothing. I kept my head down. I kept my spine straight. I did not expect a party or a cake or a phone call, but the specific silence from home had a weight to it that pressed against my sternum throughout the morning like a slow, sustained bruise. Around 1400, Sergeant First Class Cole walked past my desk. Cole was a woman built from decades of difficult decisions, weathered, precise, with eyes that had seen enough to be permanently unimpressed and permanently attentive at the same time. She didn't stop walking. She didn't make a production of it. She simply lowered a small plastic container onto the edge of my desk as she passed, the way you set down something you don't want to make a big deal of. Inside was a grocery store cupcake, neon blue frosting, a single candle in the shape of the number 7. "Welcome to the late 30s, Mercer," Cole said, not breaking stride, her voice carrying the low sandpaper rasp of someone who communicated in as few words as possible because she had learned that most words were wasted. Her hand came down on my shoulder once, a single, solid, honest contact. And then she was gone. That was it. A woman who had known me for 14 months had remembered what the woman who had raised me had apparently decided was no longer worth remembering. I picked up the cupcake and walked to the restroom at the end of the corridor. I needed 30 seconds of walls around me. I went to the last stall, locked the door, and stood looking at the candle, unlit, slightly crooked, sitting in that garish blue frosting in the dim light of a military restroom. I reached over and hit the button on the industrial hand dryer mounted to the wall. The machine roared, a violent, rattling blast of hot air that filled the small tiled space and buried everything else under 47 decibels of mechanical noise. Under the cover of that sound, I let go. I didn't cry the way I had cried at my father's funeral. Carefully, in the truck, for exactly 4 minutes before I got out and started doing what needed to be done. I broke. My shoulders came forward, my head dropped, and I stood over that sink and sobbed in a way I had not allowed myself to sob in 11 years of service, in the specific, ugly, gasping way of someone who has been holding a weight for so long that putting it down feels like falling. I cried for the daughter who had signed her name to a debt that was never hers. I cried for the father who wasn't there to tell her not to. I cried for the 4 minutes it had taken me to understand that the man who would have protected me from this moment was never coming back. I cried for the blue frosting cupcake, which was the only birthday acknowledgement I had received from anyone in my life, and which had come from a colleague, not a mother. 4 minutes, that was all I allowed. When the dryer finally clicked off, the silence was absolute. I ran cold water over my wrists, looked at the officer in the mirror. Red-eyed, jaw set, spine beginning to re-straighten of its own accord, and understood that something had just died in that stall. The part of me that was still waiting for my family to become the family I needed. The part of me that had been making excuses for them for 3 years. The part of me that believed, despite all available evidence, that love was a force that eventually corrected its own failures. Gone. Quietly, without ceremony, in a military restroom on my 37th birthday. What replaced it was colder, cleaner, and considerably more useful. That night I drove to the house. I didn't go inside. I parked a half block down with the engine off and sat in the dark. The house was blazing, every light on, cars I didn't recognize lining both sides of the street. The faint thud of music audible even through my closed windows. I opened Instagram on my phone. Dana's most recent post was a video. She was standing at the head of my father's kitchen table, holding a glass of wine, laughing into the camera, while a dozen people crowded the dining room behind her. She had set out my mother's good china, the set I had paid a moving company $340 to transport and insure, and she was using it to serve people I had never seen in my life. To new beginnings, Dana said in the video, raising her glass, in a house that finally feels like home. She was celebrating her freedom in a house built on my salary. She was playing hostess with my money, serving guests on my mother's china, in a dining room illuminated by electricity I was paying for, on a night she had apparently decided was appropriate for a party. I watched the video twice. Then I put the truck in gear and drove back to my studio apartment, where I sat at my metal desk in the dark and opened my laptop. The blue light of the screen hit my face. Cold, clinical, clarifying. I typed 5 words into the search bar. Texas property law, equitable lien. I spent the next 7 hours reading. Case law, statutes, partition proceedings, foreclosure procedures, unjust enrichment doctrine, constructive trust principles, contribution claims between co-obligors on mortgage instruments. I read until the language of the law stopped feeling foreign and started feeling like a tactical manual, something I could study, understand, and eventually use. As the first gray light of a San Antonio dawn began to press against the edges of my window, I closed the laptop. I sat in the dark for a moment longer, feeling the specific, focused calm that comes after a reconnaissance mission has returned with everything it went out to find. The girl who had pressed a pen to paper in that mortgage office 3 years ago had believed, genuinely and completely, that love was a sufficient reason to take on someone else's debt. She was gone now. The officer who had taken her place understood that debt was debt. Loyalty was not a legal obligation, and the people currently sleeping soundly in the house she was paying for had made a series of decisions that were about to become extraordinarily expensive. My 37th year had just begun, and it was going to be the most costly year of Dana Mercer's life. Scorched earth. The laser printer in the administrative office ran for 40 minutes straight. 60 months of bank statements make for a substantial document. A thick, cream-colored stack that smelled of burnt toner and the specific antiseptic odor of financial evidence. I sat at the table with a neon yellow highlighter and went through every page the way I would go through a mission debrief, methodically, without sentiment, tagging every mortgage payment, every emergency transfer, every overdraft penalty I had absorbed because the people in that house could not stop spending money I hadn't earned yet. When I was finished, I had a folder 3 inches thick. I named the digital version evidence_01. It didn't feel like a family history. It felt like a targeting package. Saturday morning, I drove to the house under the pretense of checking a leak in the water heater, a thin cover story. But my mother had never questioned my reasons for visiting, and I counted on that habit holding one more time. Ruth was in her recliner when I arrived, the television casting its familiar blue light across her face, a game show audience applauding something in the background with canned enthusiasm. She didn't look up when I came through the door. I went straight to the kitchen. My eyes moved across the counters, the way they moved across terrain on a sweep, systematically, missing nothing. Dishes in the sink, 2 wine glasses, a stack of unopened mail I recognized as utility notices, and there, half tucked beneath a coffee mug on the far counter, a scrap of paper. I pulled it out with 2 fingers. It was a printed transaction record. Coffee-stained, folded twice, the kind of thing you print and then immediately treat as disposable because you don't expect anyone else to find it. It was a Venmo ledger. Recurring payments. One name appearing every month with mechanical regularity. D. Hargrove, plus $650. Note, March rent. I stood in the kitchen of the house I was paying $3,900 a month to keep solvent, reading a receipt for rent money being collected in my childhood bedroom by the woman who had told my mother she was destitute, and I felt a cold, electric clarity move through me from the base of my skull to the soles of my feet. While I was eating rice out of a plastic bowl on a milk crate, Dana was running an unlicensed boarding house in my bedroom and pocketing $650 a month tax-free and telling our mother she had nothing. I photographed the ledger, 3 shots, different angles, all legible. Then I walked upstairs. The lock was still there, shiny brass, mocking, and beside it now, a second pair of boots. These were newer than the last ones I had photographed. Steel-toed, clean, recently purchased. The kind of boots a man buys when he is planning to stay somewhere for a while. I photographed everything. The boots, the lock, the scuff marks on the door frame where the new hardware had been installed over the old. I walked back downstairs, said a quiet goodbye to my mother that she acknowledged with a half wave in the direction of the television, and drove back to the base. Monday morning, I spread the photographs and bank statements across my desk like a tactical map. Sergeant Cole came over without being asked. She looked at the Venmo ledger. She looked at the photograph of the boots. She looked at 60 months of highlighted bank statements representing $3,900 extracted from my account every 30 days with the reliability of a tax collection agency. She stood up, crossed her arms over her chest, and was quiet for a long moment. "Don't call them family anymore, Mercer," she said finally. Her voice was low and had the specific gravity of someone who had arrived at a conclusion through a long and difficult process and was sharing it as a gift. Family doesn't rent your bedroom to a stranger for beer money while you're out there bleeding for them. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is theft, plain and simple. She reached into her chest pocket and produced a business card. Matte black, heavy stock, a name and number embossed in silver that caught the fluorescent light of the office. "Catherine Dunn. She's not a regular attorney," Cole said, sliding the card across the desk. "She's a wolf. And you're going to need a wolf to bite back against people who think love is a sufficient legal defense for taking everything you have." I picked up the card. The edges were sharp enough to draw blood. "Thank you, Cole," I said. "Don't thank me yet," she replied, already turning back toward her office. "Wait until the smoke clears." Sunday dinner at the Holland house had once smelled like my father's slow-cooked brisket and the specific warmth of a home where someone was genuinely glad you had arrived. Now it smelled like store-bought rotisserie chicken and Dana's perfume, and the low-grade tension of a room where everyone was pretending things were fine because acknowledging the truth would require doing something about it. I had driven over with a pan of cornbread, my father's recipe, the one he made every Sunday without fail, butter and honey and yellow cornmeal that filled whatever room it was baking in with a smell that was basically the architectural definition of home. I set it on the counter. Nobody commented on it. I was the help, and the help didn't receive acknowledgement for the food they brought. We sat at the oak table. Dana was at the head, my father's chair, which she had apparently decided was hers now, swirling a glass of wine with the proprietary ease of someone who had never once considered that the roof over her head was a gift she hadn't earned. "The contractors are coming next week," she announced, to no one in particular and everyone simultaneously. "We're pulling up the hardwood on the second floor. It's warped in 2 places and it looks cheap. I'm thinking wide plank, white oak. It'll open the whole upstairs up." I set my fork down. The sound it made against the plate was small and precise. "With whose money, Dana?" I said. The table went still. Dana's expression shifted. Not to embarrassment, not to guilt, but to the specific, practiced hostility of someone who has been using a particular weapon for so long that reaching for it has become completely automatic. "Excuse me?" she said. Her voice climbed immediately to the register she used for public performances of grievance. "Are you seriously doing this right now? At dinner? In front of guests?" $650 a month, I said. D. Hargrove, Venmo, rent. The color left her face. Not gradually, all at once, the way a light goes out. "I don't know what you're—" "I have the transaction record," I said. "I have photographs of his boots outside my locked bedroom door. I have 60 months of bank statements showing $3,900 leaving my account every single month. And I have your contribution to that total, which is 0. I looked at her steadily. "I also have your child support affidavit from Cook County, where you swore under oath that your total monthly income was 0, while you were collecting $650 a month in my bedroom, tax-free." The silence that followed was total. Aunt Patrice set down her fork. My mother's hands went still in her lap. Dana opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Then she stood up, and the performance began in earnest. "You come into this house," she said, her voice rising, her hands moving with the grand, sweeping theatrics of someone who understood that volume and motion could sometimes substitute for argument. "And you throw numbers around like you own the place." "I do own the place," I said quietly. "My name is on the deed." My credit secured the loan. My salary services the debt. I own this place in every way that actually matters. You are a guest here, she snapped. You've always been a guest. You think writing checks makes you family? You think money makes you the head of this house? I am here every day. I am the one taking Mom to her appointments, doing the grocery runs, keeping things running. While charging a man $650 a month to sleep in my room, I said. She reached for me. I don't think she planned it. I think it was the specific, cornered rage of someone who has just watched their entire operational structure collapse in the space of 4 sentences and has no remaining move except a physical one. Both palms connected with my shoulders, hard, deliberate, with everything she had. My boots slipped on the tile. My back hit the floor. My father's floor. The ceramic squares he had grouted on a Saturday afternoon 23 years ago while I sat on the counter eating saltines and handing him tools. For 1 full second, I lay there looking up at the water-stained ceiling and listened to the laughter begin. Dana, Aunt Patrice, the 2 women I had never met who were eating food bought with my salary. I looked at my mother. Ruth was looking at the table. Every remaining molecule of daughterly obligation I had been carrying for 3 years, every residual thread of the loyalty that had brought me to that mortgage office, that had kept me on that milk crate, that had made me eat beans in a studio apartment so the lights stayed on in this house, dissolved. Cleanly, completely, without residue. I rolled onto my side. I pushed myself up. I smoothed the front of my shirt and straightened my spine and looked at my sister across the wreckage of Sunday dinner. Enjoy your meal, I said. My voice was the quietest thing in the room. It's the last free one you'll ever have. I reached into my pocket. My thumb found the screen. The email had been drafted for 6 days. Catherine Dunn's language, precise and devastating, attached to 60 months of evidence, addressed to Dana, to my mother, to Dana's ex-husband's attorneys, and to the Cook County Civil Court clerk handling her child support case. I pressed send. 1 tap. Cold as a trigger pull. I walked out the front door into the San Antonio night. Warm, clear, smelling of cedar and distant rain, and I did not look back at the house that had been consuming me for 3 years. I walked to my truck, got in, and sat for a moment in the dark with my hands on the wheel. My phone was already beginning to vibrate. I set it face down on the passenger seat. The fuse was lit. I started the engine and pulled away from the curb, and as the house disappeared in my rearview mirror, I felt something I had not felt in 3 years. Not happiness exactly, and not relief exactly, but the specific, clean sensation of a soldier who has finally, after a very long and costly campaign, identified the exit and started moving toward it. Well, the calls came through the night like incoming fire. By 600, the tally was precise. 71 missed calls, 38 text messages, 4 voicemails. I made coffee on my single-burner hot plate and sat on my milk crate in the gray pre-dawn light of my studio apartment and hit speakerphone. Voicemail 1, 22:14 hours. Ruth. Her voice was thin, trembling, and deployed with the specific theatrical timing of a woman who had been using emotional distress as a management tool for 40 years. Reagan, please. I think I'm having chest pains. You can't do this. You're going to kill your mother. Please call me back right now. I took a sip of coffee. Voicemail 2. 23:47 hours. Dana. Pure acid. No performance, no tears. Just the concentrated, unfiltered fury of someone who has just discovered that the person they've been exploiting has been keeping records. You think a lawyer is going to scare me? I live here. You signed those papers. I will burn this house to the ground before I let you take it from us. You are dead to me. You hear me? Dead. I took another sip of coffee. Voicemail 3, 3:31 hours, Dana again. The acid was gone. What replaced it was something rawer and considerably less controlled. The sound of a person who had spent the previous 5 hours on the phone with an attorney and had just been told, in the specific, unvarnished language of legal professionals, what perjury on a court filing actually means in the state of Texas. Chloe, Reagan, please. Neil's lawyers are involved now. They're talking about, please just call me. We can fix this. Tell them it was a mistake. We're family, please. I deleted all 3 voicemails with 3 taps. Then I picked up the matte black card from the corner of my desk, where it had been sitting for 9 days. Catherine Dunn answered on the second ring. Dunn, she said. Her voice was alert and unhurried, the voice of someone who kept the kind of hours that complicated people required. It's Reagan Mercer, I said. The house is burning. I need to know how much we can recover from the wreckage. A brief pause. "I've been waiting for this call," she said. "Come in tomorrow morning. Bring everything." I hung up, walked to the window, and watched the first thin line of sunrise press against the eastern edge of San Antonio. The war was no longer in the shadows. It was on the front lawn. And for the first time in 37 months, I was the one holding the map. Funbon, Ketuk, what a soldier keeps. Catherine Dunn's office was on the 14th floor of a glass tower on Commerce Street, overlooking the San Antonio River Walk from a height that made the tourists below look like slow-moving punctuation. The office smelled of black coffee and legal volumes, and the particular focused energy of a space where consequential things happened regularly and sentiment was not among them. Catherine herself was a compact woman in her mid-50s, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, with the specific economy of movement that belongs to people who have learned that most gestures are wasted. She had read the first 30 pages of Evidence_01 before I finished sitting down. She didn't offer sympathy. She offered strategy. Phase 1, she said, uncapping a pen that looked like it could file its own briefs. "We stop every automatic payment today. Not tomorrow. Not at the end of the billing cycle. Today. The mortgage goes into technical default in your name, which creates the legal pressure we need to force action." "And my credit score?" I said. "Will drop," she said without apology. 40 to 50 points, depending on how long the process runs. You need to decide right now whether that number matters more than the next 3 years of your life. I had walked through mortar fire in 2 countries. I had spent 11 years making decisions under conditions where the cost of the wrong answer was measured in lives rather than credit ratings. "Do it," I said. "Phase 2. She turned a page. "I draft a formal demand letter. Your mother has 30 days to refinance the property in her own name and remove you from the deed. We both know she can't. She has no qualifying income and no co-signer. But the 30 days creates a legal record that we offered a reasonable resolution before pursuing litigation." "And phase 3? Catherine looked up from the folder. The corner of her mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. "Phase 3 is a partition action. We petition the court to force the sale of the property. Your equity, everything you've paid above and beyond what's been recovered in the market, gets calculated, documented, and argued. You won't get all of it back. Short sales are ugly, but you will get something, and more importantly, you will get your name off that deed and your credit off that hook." She set the pen down. "There's also the perjury matter," she said. "Your sister filed a sworn affidavit with the family court claiming 0 income while collecting undocumented rent from an unlicensed tenant in a property she has no legal interest in. That's not a civil issue. That's a criminal one. I have a colleague in the DA's office who will find it very interesting." I thought about the Venmo ledger, the coffee-stained paper, D. Hargrove, plus $650. "How long does all of this take? 6 months minimum? Possibly 9. She picked up the pen again. "Are you prepared for your family to hate you for that entire period?" I looked out her window at the river walk 14 floors below. Tourists moving slowly along the water, the cypress trees trailing their branches, the city going about its ordinary business entirely indifferent to the conversation happening above it. "They already do," I said. "They just used to be polite about it." Catherine Dunn laughed. A short, genuine sound like a door opening briefly onto something warmer. "Sign the retainer," she said, sliding the document across the desk. My hand was steady, my grip was firm. I signed my name and felt, for the first time in 37 months, like the signature was working in my favor. "Huh?" Dana came to the base on a Wednesday. I want to be precise about this because the details matter. She did not get on to the installation. Fort Sam Houston has a security apparatus that exists for reasons that have nothing to do with my family drama, and the gate guards were not moved by her argument that she had urgent personal business with one of the officers inside. What she did was park outside the visitor entrance and call my phone 17 times in 40 minutes. I let all 17 go to voicemail. On the 18th call I picked up. "You need to stop this," she said. Her voice was doing the thing it did when she was genuinely frightened and trying to disguise it as anger, high, slightly breathless, hitting the wrong notes. "Withdraw the filing. Tell the court it was a mistake. Neil's lawyers are talking about using the perjury thing in the custody case, and if that happens—" "Donna," I said. She stopped. "I gave this family 3 years," I said. My voice was quiet. Around me, the motor pool went about its business. Engines running, equipment moving, the ordinary, organized noise of a military installation doing what military installations do. 37 months, $3,900 every single month. I ate beans on a milk crate. I drove a truck that should have been retired 4 years ago. I lived in an apartment where the pipes bled rust every morning. I did all of that so you could drink Chardonnay in my bedroom and charge a stranger $650 a month for the privilege of sleeping in my childhood memories. A long silence. "We're family," she said. Her voice had dropped. The performance was gone. What was left was something more honest and considerably more pathetic, the voice of a person who has finally run out of scripts. "You don't do this to family." "You're right," I said. "You don't." I ended the call. I stood in the San Antonio sunshine for a moment, my phone in my hand, and then I went back to work. I called my mother on a Thursday evening. I had been preparing for the conversation the way I prepared for anything with significant stakes, methodically, without illusion, clear-eyed about what I wanted to accomplish and what I was willing to accept as an outcome. Ruth answered on the first ring, which meant she had been waiting. "Reagan," she said, and then before I could speak, "I didn't know." I let the silence sit for a moment. "She told me she was sending you $300 a month," my mother said. "She swore to me. She swore on your father's memory. I thought you two had an arrangement. I thought—" "Mom," I said. She went quiet. "She never sent $1, I said. "Not one. And you walked past a stranger's muddy work boots in the upstairs hallway every single morning for 4 months, and you chose not to ask about them. You knew something was wrong. You chose not to look at it directly, because looking at it directly would have required you to do something about it." A long, wet silence. "I'm old," she said finally. "I'm sick. I can't manage conflict the way you can. I just wanted everyone to be okay. I just wanted peace." "You wanted peace that I was paying for," I said. "And I paid for it. For 3 years I paid for it. But I'm not paying for it anymore." "Where will I go?" Her voice cracked. "The papers from that woman say the house has to be sold. Reagan, I cannot." "You're going to sell the house," I said. "You're going to take whatever equity remains after the bank and the attorneys and the court costs, and you're going to use it to secure a small apartment. Your Social Security covers a 1-bedroom in a decent complex on the north side." I looked it up. "It covers it comfortably if you're not supplementing anyone else's lifestyle." "You're putting me out," she said. "After everything I did for you, after everything I sacrificed." I closed my eyes. I thought about a mortgage office in a strip mall, about fingernails pressing crescents into my forearm, about a promise made with tears that had been calculated to the precise emotional pressure required to produce a signature. "I paid my debt, Mom," I said. "In full. $238,000 worth of full. I'm not your bank anymore. I'm not your solution. I'm your daughter, and I would like someday to have the kind of relationship where that means something that doesn't have a dollar amount attached to it. But that conversation is not available today." "Reagan." "Don't call this number," I said. "When you're settled and when some time has passed, maybe we try again. But right now, we're done." I pressed the red button. I sat in the silence of my studio apartment and listened to the city outside my thin walls. Sirens, traffic, the distant bass of music from somewhere down the block. And I waited for the guilt to arrive. It didn't. What arrived instead was something quieter and more substantial. Not happiness, not triumph. Something closer to the feeling at the end of a very long march when you finally set the rucksack down and your body slowly remembers what it feels like to carry only its own weight. I went into my contacts. I blocked my mother's number. I blocked Dana's number. I sat on the edge of my mattress in the dark and breathed my own air for the first time in 3 years. The settlement check arrived 6 months and 11 days after Catherine Dunn filed the partition action. The number was $91,000. It was not the $238,000 I had paid into that mortgage over 37 months. It was not justice in any complete or satisfying sense of the word. But it was real, and it was mine, and it had been extracted from a situation that had been specifically designed to leave me with nothing, and that made it feel like considerably more than its face value. My credit score dropped 44 points the day the short sale finalized. I watched the notification appear on my phone and felt nothing in particular. A number on a screen, collateral damage from a campaign that had been worth fighting. It would recover. I would rebuild it the same way I had built it the first time, methodically, without drama, one on-time payment at a time. Dana's perjury case worked its way through the system with the slow, grinding patience of institutional justice. She hired an attorney she couldn't afford, made arguments that didn't hold, and eventually accepted a plea arrangement that involved community service, a fine and a formal entry on her record that would make future sworn statements considerably more complicated to file. The tenant, D. Hargrove, whose boots had started this entire chain of events, moved out the week the partition notice was served and left a security deposit dispute that became Dana's problem and nobody else's. My mother moved into a one-bedroom apartment in a complex on the north side of the city. It was clean, well-maintained, and cost exactly what her Social Security covered. I knew this because Catherine Dunn had researched it as part of the settlement negotiation. I had not visited. I was not ready for that conversation, and I had learned over 37 months of paying for things I couldn't afford that readiness was not a sentiment, it was a condition, and conditions had to be met before action was warranted. I put the $91,000 down payment on a two-bedroom condo on the east side of San Antonio. 12th floor, corner unit, floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city in a long, unobstructed sweep. The kind of view that exists to remind you that the place you are standing is real and solid, and yours in every way that a place can be yours. The pipes did not bleed rust. The radiator did not clank. The air smelled of clean ventilation and the specific, subtle luxury of a space that had been maintained by someone who cared about it. I bought a bed frame. This sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. For 37 months, I had slept on a mattress on the floor of a studio apartment because a bed frame was $200 I could not justify spending while the mortgage was running. The first night I slept in a real bed, in a room that was mine. Not a room I was renting from necessity, not a room I had moved into because it was all I could afford after feeding the machine in the suburbs, but a room I had chosen, in a home I had selected, at a price I had negotiated. I lay on my back in the dark and listened to the city outside the windows and understood that this specific silence, the silence of a space that owed nothing to anyone, that was not a compromise or a concession or a temporary measure, was what I had been working toward for a very long time. I threw out every piece of clothing that carried the memory of those 37 months. The worn jeans, the faded shirts I had worn on the milk crate, the jacket I had never retrieved from the closet of my childhood bedroom. I bought wool. I bought quality. I bought things designed to last. Cole came over on a Friday evening 3 months after I moved in. She arrived with a bottle of Texas Hill Country white wine. Good wine, chosen by someone who had opinions about wine and wasn't shy about them. And she stood at my floor-to-ceiling windows for a long moment, looking out at the city before she said anything. "Nice place, Mercer," she said. "It's quiet," I said. We sat on my couch, a real couch, not a lawn chair or a folding seat, a deep charcoal sectional that I had spent 45 minutes selecting because I was allowed to spend 45 minutes on something like that now. And we talked for 3 hours. Not about the lawsuit, not about Dana or Ruth or the 37 months or the $91,000 check or the 44 credit points. We talked about the new training rotation and the junior officer who kept misreading topographical maps and whether the Hill Country wine was better than the Napa equivalent at the same price point. We talked about nothing that required damage assessment or tactical planning or the management of consequences. We talked like two people who had earned an ordinary evening. At one point, Cole looked around the apartment, the clean lines, the real furniture, the view, and nodded once with the slow, satisfied economy of someone who understood what it had taken to get here without needing it, explained. "You did right, Mercer," she said. "That was all. It was enough." On a Sunday morning, 6 months after I moved in, I stood in my kitchen, with its clean counters and functioning appliances and pipes that ran clear, and I made my father's cornbread. Butter, honey, yellow cornmeal. The smell that had always meant, in my body's oldest memory, that someone was home and the day was going to be okay. I set the table for one white plate, one glass of water, one linen napkin folded into a simple rectangle because I liked the way it looked and there was no one to tell me it was more effort than the occasion required. I cut into the cornbread and listened to the crust crack, that specific, dry, satisfying sound that means the bread has come out right. and I took a bite and looked out my window at San Antonio spread below me in the Sunday morning light. The city was quiet at this hour, the streets unhurried, the sky a pale, clean blue that promised nothing dramatic. My father was gone. That was still true, and would always be true, and the grief of it had not disappeared. It had simply found its proper size, which was large but no longer crushing, present but no longer the loudest thing in the room. I thought about him on the John Deere in the front yard. I thought about Saturday afternoons and saltine crackers and the names of tools I hadn't known. I thought about the man who had laid the ceramic tiles that his daughter had eventually been knocked onto by the person he had raised her alongside, and I thought about how he would have handled the past 3 years, and I decided that the most honest answer was that he would not have let them happen, that his presence alone would have changed the chemistry of the household in ways that made the past 3 years unnecessary. But he was gone, and I was here, in a home I had chosen, eating bread I had made, on a morning that owed nothing to anyone. I had spent 37 months being the resource, the reliable one, the soldier who took the objective without asking whether the objective was worth taking. I knew something now that I had not known when I picked up that pen in the mortgage office. Loyalty is not the same thing as obligation. Love is not the same thing as debt. And the people who confuse the two, who hand you a crisis and call it family, who press their fingernails into your arm and call it need, who lock the door of your childhood bedroom and call it home, those people are not your squad. Your squad is the woman who puts a grocery store cupcake on your desk and asks nothing in return. Your squad is the attorney who reads 30 pages of evidence before she offers you a seat. Your squad is the silence of a Sunday morning in a home you earned. I finished the cornbread. I washed my plate, dried it, and put it away in the cabinet where it belonged. Then I put on my coat and went for a walk. Through my neighborhood, past the coffee shop on the corner where I had started stopping in the mornings without checking my bank balance first, into the clear San Antonio air that smelled of cedar and possibility. I was 37 years old. I was the only person I had to answer to. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt exactly like enough. If this story found you at the right moment, if you've ever been the one holding the line while everyone else held out their hands, share it with someone who needs to hear that getting out is not giving up. It's surviving. Subscribe and ring the bell. We tell one story a week, and we try to make every one of them worth your time. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done differently? And what would you have done the same?